Hey guys, welcome back to another episode. Thanks for tuning in. I got to tell you guys, the channel's been growing really well, so I appreciate all of you that are sharing the channel with your friends and family. It definitely is starting to get out there, and I'm getting a lot of really positive feedback, so thank you to all of you that are watching. And I also want to point out that today's episode is based off of some subscriber questions that I did on a video several weeks ago regarding the weedless, the most weedless baits for fishing weeds. And the comments that I got on that were that they wanted to know what I thought the most weedless baits were for fishing wood. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I've got here, 5 baits that I will have tied on anytime I know I'm fishing wood. And, you know, this will work from anywhere from a single stump all the way up to the gnarliest, nastiest, thickest wood piles. But I do just want to point out that there are times you can't really do much in terms of a weedless bait if your line is getting caught in the wood. So the first thing I want to point out is if you're throwing braid, the likelihood that your line is going to saw into a soft piece of wood is much greater than if you're throwing fluorocarbon or monofilament or a different line. The issue with that, though, guys, is a lot of times you have to be throwing braid into some of the thickest stuff. Otherwise, you're just not going to get the fish out. So it's something to be aware of, that a lot of times it's not your bait that's getting stuck. It's your line that's digging into a piece of wood, getting your bait stuck or getting your bait wedged. The same thing can be said if you're fishing trees that have a bunch of bark on it. Well, those bark pieces are just like waiting to catch your line. And if your line gets wedged in a piece of bark, it doesn't matter what bait you're throwing. It really doesn't. So, you know, I personally like to throw fluorocarbon if I know I can get away with it. So if I'm fishing just single laydowns or I'm fishing single stumps, I won't go with really heavy braided line because I know that I have a good likelihood to get the fish out of there with a heavier fluorocarbon, and I'm not going to get hung up nearly as much, which isn't going to ruin those fishing spots as much as if I were getting stuck with braid. So it's just something to be aware of before I get into the baits. So here I do have my 5 baits, and this is the first thing I'm going to start off with is just a spinner bait. You know, this is a War Eagle 1/2 ounce spinner bait, one of my favorite baits for fishing around wood. It works great, you know, as a parallel bait. It works great to come up and over limbs. And you wouldn't think that these are all that weedless because it's got an exposed hook. But in reality, if you're cognizant of the fact that you're throwing this bait around wood, you just have to bring it up and over the limbs, but it will come through really weedless. They are not weedless when you're reeling them really fast and you hit a branch, because at that point the branch will push the spinner bait blade arm out of the way and catch the hook every time. But if you're just slow rolling the bait through a tree limb or through, you know, along a laydown, it will be an extremely weedless bait. And it's a killer bait for getting bit, especially when you bring it up over a limb and let it flutter back down on the backside. I can't tell you the number of big fish I've caught doing that. So that's the first bait, definitely a killer. The next, guys, is just a Texas rigged craw. You know, I mean, there's nothing special about it. Honestly, it's a Texas rigged anything, right? In this case, this is a Berkeley Mech Scent Creature Hog, one of my favorite pitching baits. But any Texas rigged bait, whether it's a plastic worm, a stick bait, a craw, you know, whatever it is going to come through a tree great. You know, you definitely want to make sure that when you do rig it, you pinch the bait up over the tip of the hook so that it's, you know, that it's weedless. If you leave it like that or leave it exposed, you're definitely going to get stuck. But as long as you pinch the bait up on the hook, you're not going to get stuck, and it's extremely weedless. So you definitely want to have a Texas rigged plastic of whatever your favorite plastic bait is. You got to have one. That's probably the second most weedless bait that I know of. The next, guys, just a frog. You know, everyone says a frog is a grass bait. They are great grass baits, but they are so underutilized around wood and in open water. I mean, it's a topwater bait that you can use as a walking bait. I will say, when throwing a frog, if I'm throwing it around wood, I do not want to use a popping frog. The reason for that is that cup lip will catch the branches, and you can't pull it up and over the branches as well as you can a bait that's got a pointed nose on it. So I would not be throwing a walking frog, if I know I'm fishing around wood all day long. I would rather throw a frog that's got a pointed nose. Just personal preference. The popping frog style is still going to be weedless. You're just not going to be able to work it through the wood nearly as well. So that was the third bait. The fourth one might surprise a lot of you guys, and it's a Squarebill crankbait. So this is an RP custom balsa made crankbait. I personally like to use a balsa crankbait because they have extreme buoyancy and they float to the surface really quick. So if I'm working this bait down into some limbs and I kill it, that bait will kind of back up and float to the surface. So I can work it in and around the limbs. And this is similar to what I was saying about the spinnerbait. You need to be aware that you're working this bait through laydowns and through trees. If you just throw it and crank it hard, you're going to get stuck all the time. If you're, throwing it into that brush pile or into that laydown and you're working it nice and slow and you're expecting it to hit the branches and you expect it, you're just walking it through the tree, guys. That's all you need to do. You just don't want to crank it down hard. You just want to slowly walk it through. When you see it coming close to a limb, you got to be aware of that. And that's when you back it up, load it, let it float over, and you can pull it in and around the tree. And that's when you're going to get most of your bites anyways. You want to give it that erratic action. You want to reel it, kill it, and as soon as you let it float and back up, the fish will think that it's trying to escape, and that's when you get a bunch of your hits. So in my opinion, a Balsa Squarebill crankbait is an absolute killer. And this is just one of my favorites. It works absolutely wonderful. The last and my favorite bait for fishing around laydowns, my favorite weedless bait, is a jig. Guys, a jig is probably the #1 bait to work around laydowns. This is a Dirty Jigs Luke Clausen compact. Match it with whatever your favorite trailer is, and you've got probably one of the most dynamic baits for fishing around wood. Whether it's a laydown, a stump, or a big brush pile, a jig is an absolute must if you're fishing wood. Now, I do want to point out one other thing to you. In this case, you can see the line tie is perpendicular to the hook, right? That is a huge key if you're fishing around wood. The reason for that is when, if my hand is a log, when that jig comes to it, that line tie will then pull the bait up and over the top because the line tie is perpendicular. If you had a straight line tie, a straight one to the hook shank, when that bait comes to the log, it's not going to want to come up and over. It's going to roll to one of the two sides. And as soon as it rolls to one of the two sides, it'll then roll into the log, and that's when you get your hook stuck in that piece of wood. So whatever jig you choose, if you're fishing heavily around wood cover, in my opinion, guys, you want to throw a perpendicular line tie to the hook shank. But a jig is my absolute go-to #1 bait anytime I'm fishing around wood. All 5 of these baits are great, but I feel like the jig is probably the most weedless and the most versatile and gets the most bites. So check them out, guys. If you haven't been fishing any of these 5 baits around wood, give it a try. I think you'll find that they're less weedless and they get a lot of bites for you. So thanks for watching, guys. Stay tuned. New tips and tricks come out every day.